Okay, guys, I'm not here today. Sorry I can't be with you, but you're going to be, we're talking today about the Protestant Reformation. So let's actually kind of look at the words here. We see Protestant Reformation. So if we're looking at what do you think is the root word there, Protestant? Hopefully you see protest. So obviously we're thinking about the fact that they're going to be protesting something. And then we look at Reformation. Hopefully you see the word reform. And to reform means to change. And so there are people who are protesting something and asking for a change. So as we keep going here, we'll kind of see what that is. So we think about life kind of before the Renaissance and Reformation. Remember that everything is focused around the church. Everyone is Christian. And if you're in Western Europe, you are Roman Catholic. We do have the Orthodox in Russia, but we're focusing here on Western Europe. We're talking about Germany and France and England, Spain, etc. Catholic Church is everywhere. It's extremely powerful. Well, then something changes and happens. The Black Death happens, and as we know, the Bubonic Plague kind of wipes out 1/3 of Europe's population. And anytime something bad had happened, what did you do? You turned to the church. And the church isn't able to solve this, and this is a big concern for people. They begin to kind of question the church. If we actually look at this political cartoon here, what do you see? So up here, this is Latin, ego fum papa, so we don't really know what that says. This guy kind of looks pretty scary. He's like reaching out to grab. Come down here. What do you notice? Do you see the crosses? And do you notice that these are actually coffins? So kind of representing death here, but this is a really nice robe. And if we come back up here, Papa, this is Latin for Pope. And so obviously not a very nice portrayal of the Pope, kind of recognizing how he wasn't able to do anything against the Black Death. So think about that. If people are doing these kind of political cartoons, you think they might have been getting in trouble with the church? Now, if you're looking at your notes, the very first line there has a little key, and it says the Renaissance is the key to the Reformation. And that is because the Renaissance is what people are, remember, that focus on the individual or focused on this life, not the next life, this life. And so people are actually beginning to question things. And that's going to lead to people questioning things during the Reformation. Remember, at any time during the PowerPoint, if you need more time, you just need to hit the pause button so that you can have more time to write things down. Your next blank is what is a heretic? So if you had said bad things about the church, you would have been called a heretic. You would have been accused of heresy. And heresy is whenever someone speaks out against the church. And what's the result of heresy? You'd be kicked out of the church, and the fancy word for that is you'd be excommunicated. Now, why is that such a big deal? If you're excommunicated, that means you lose your church membership. Now, let's think about this. During the Middle Ages, life revolves around the church. Now, most people couldn't read, and so when the priest tells you something, you believe him because you can't read for yourself in the Bible. Now, the Bible does not say this. The Bible does not say that you need church membership to get into heaven, but that's what was taught, that you needed church membership in order to get into heaven. So as a result of that, if you're excommunicated, that means you've lost your church membership. Now, life stinks, remember, during the Middle Ages, and so your only hope is that you die and you go to heaven. And now, if you're excommunicated, you can't even go to heaven. So this is why excommunication is such a big deal, because it wouldn't allow you to go to heaven. And I think sometimes we don't realize why that's such a big deal. So who are these heretics? Who are these people who are questioning the church? Well, we have some early reformers, and these are people who are kind of inspiring the guys who come later. Our first one is John Wycliffe, or Wycliffe. And he is the morning star of the Reformation, which means that he's kind of coming and starting this early. And he's attacking the corruption of the Pope. Now, sadly, the church had become corrupt. There was good people in the church, but unfortunately, there were also a lot of bad people who were taking advantage and taking money and were abusing their position. Now, Wycliffe is significant because he believed that people didn't really understand what the Bible said. So he said the best way to deal with that was to translate the Bible into all languages. So if I live in England, which Wycliffe did, and I couldn't read the Bible in English because it wasn't available, it would only have been in Latin. And he said it should be translated into the common language. And if you know the fancy vocabulary for the common language, it's the vernacular. So what's the vernacular of America? English. What's the vernacular of France? French. What's the vernacular of Germany? German. So he wanted the Bible translated for everyone. And he thought it was important to educate the common people. And that's starting to happen, and we're going to see more of that. So some of these early reformers are going to get excommunicated and actually suffer even worse fate. So this is Jan Hus. You say his name Jan, not Jan. Like the English version of that would be John. And he's from what is the present-day Czech Republic. And he was criticizing the wealth of the church, how the church just kept getting more and more wealthy. And he thought that bishops should be elected because he saw people being appointed. And these were people who didn't really love God. And were more about how could they get more money. And so he thought that it should be people who genuinely wanted to be priests. So he actually was at a council and presented his issues. They excommunicated him, and then he was burned at the stake, which you can see at this image here. Maybe you remember Joan of Arc. She was also burned at the stake for being a heretic. Erasmus we talked about the other day, and Erasmus, he wrote the book The Praise of the Folly, which criticized the practices of the Catholic Church, and he wanted to reform the church. Remember, none of these guys are advocating that we need to start a new church. They're all just saying we need to make some changes. He also believed very strongly in this concept of free will, that things weren't predetermined, that we can make choices. And this is going to be a key thing that's part of the Protestant Reformation. And how are all these ideas spreading? They're spreading because of the printing press. Remember that the printing press, look down here, this is huge. Before, remember that books are being printed by hand. So now we're seeing, instead of being 40 pages per day, with the printing press, 3,600 pages per day. And that's just really impressive. People have more access to books, therefore literacy is increasing, books are cheaper, and they are more available. Now, why is this important? Think about this. Wycliffe, if he thinks the Bible needs to be translated for all languages, how would that have been spread before? Just people telling. Now they can actually, and it wouldn't get very far. Now we can actually print them, and the ideas can be really spread very far. If you ever get to go to London, you go to the British Library. When I went there, I was able to see one of the first things that Gutenberg printed, and one of the first things he printed was the Bible, and you can actually see the Gutenberg Bible is what it's called, because that was one of his first big printing. So what is the Protestant Reformation? Why don't you pause here for a moment so you can get the definition down, and then I'll talk a little more. So Protestant Reformation is this religious movement that splits the church. Now do remember the church is already split in 1054 between the Orthodox and the Catholic. But again, that's Eastern Europe. We're talking about Western Europe now. And this then is going to lead to the establishment of new churches. So they start out just protesting and asking for change, and when they don't get that change, that's going to lead to the new churches. Why are people displeased? This is your 1, 2, 3 underneath the definition, and that's because of the corruption, financial, also the abuse of powers, and then immorality. Immorality is when you know the difference between right and wrong, and you choose to do the wrong thing. And for example, one of the things that was happening was that in Jerusalem, in Rome, Catholic priests are not supposed to be married. And these Catholic priests, not only were they not supposed to be married, they're supposed to be married to God, to the church. And they actually had prostitutes who specifically were there for priests. And that's obviously very immoral. That's just one example of some things that were happening during that time period. So what's going to spark the Reformation? What's going to be that catalyst, that change? Is another big thing is the indulgences, and that's another problem. Indulgences are these pardons that were issued by the Pope that could reduce your time in purgatory or even get you out of punishment in general. Now, I'm going to give you a very simplified version of purgatory. Please understand that this is a much more complex, but I'm giving you a very simplified version. This is still Catholic doctrine today. They believe in purgatory. And when you die, everybody goes to purgatory. It's kind of like the waiting room before heaven or hell. It's not particularly a nice place. It's not as bad as hell, but it's not particularly fun either. And you hang out in purgatory until you go to heaven or hell. So let's say that your sweet little granny has died and she's gone to purgatory. And they're telling you how horrible purgatory is. And they say, hey, if you just give us a couple of pieces of gold or silver, we'll pray her out of purgatory. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to give the money. And so that's what indulgences are, a way for you to get your family out of purgatory. And it was up to you to pray them out or to give them money. And so a lot of people give money, and it's taken advantage of. And one of these famous guys actually collects money to build this. This is St. Peter's Cathedral. Remember I told you about La Pieta? It's inside of here. This is an obelisk where St. Peter was supposedly crucified. This is the Vatican here, like where the Sistine Chapel is, and it comes out here at the St. Peter's Cathedral. So this is just kind of a little cartoon kind of describing the advantages of indulgences. Hey, give me money and don't worry about going to hell. You're going to go directly to heaven. You won't go to purgatory, or you'll get out of purgatory faster. The most famous of these sellers was Johann Tetzel, and he asked for money to rebuild the church, but he would sell it as an indulgence. Now, since then, the Catholic Church has said that this is not okay, but this was happening at this time period, and a lot of people had a real problem with this. He even had a little saying, every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. So even a little catchphrase. A coffer is the box that you put a coin in. So every time a coin in the coffer rings, like it's dropped in the coffer, then a soul from purgatory springs. So again, people don't know that this isn't in the Bible because they can't read it themselves. Everything's in Latin, and so it was the job of the priest to educate people, and if they're not telling you the exact truth, then obviously here's a problem. So Martin Luther is the father of the Protestant Reformation. If you don't remember anybody else from today, this is the guy you got to remember, Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was a German monk, and his family didn't actually want him to be a priest, but he grew up and decided he wanted to be. He really struggled with this whole idea of how could you be saved, and he did a lot of study and he had a lot of questions. And he's a professor of theology, and he went to the University of Wittenberg, which is in Germany, so he is German. He objected to Tetzel. He also traveled to Rome, and he was just shocked by the things that he saw there, the priests who were not very godly. And he began to do a lot of study and just reading what does the Bible actually say about things. And he kind of came to these conclusions. He said the church has no say over your salvation. They're not the ones who determine your salvation. That's between you and God. He also identified that the church was taking advantage of Christians, especially the poor, because I promise you those indulgences are not cheap. And then this is a key thing that distinguishes Protestants, is that Christians were not giving salvation for good works. You're not going to become a Christian because you do things. Instead, it's because of grace. And that's not to say that Christians shouldn't do good. If you are a Christian, you automatically do good works, but good works is not what saves you. It's your faith and it's grace. He wrote these ideas down. They're written on a 95 Theses, and that's this document, and he actually nailed it to the door of the church at his university. Now, this sounds really weird. Who's going to go nail things on the church door? Well, it's actually not weird. This was what happened during the time period. They actually would go and, it's like a bulletin board. If you wanted to have a discussion, you went up and put your ideas up there. So he went and put them up there. And again, he doesn't want to start a new church. He just wants to make changes. And he's like, these are the problems. And most of his problems were about indulgences. He also was really concerned about the power of the Pope. He thought that the Pope was abusing his power. And he was very concerned about the wealth of the church. And ultimately, he's saying the Pope isn't the ultimate authority. It's the Bible. What does the Bible say? And again, I can't stress this enough because this is the key difference with Protestants is it's grace is by faith. It's only by what you believe. It's not works. You can't do anything to get yourself into heaven. It's not about how much good stuff you do. It's just about grace. And basically, grace is that Jesus had to die, and he gives you this, through Jesus, you can be reconnected with God. And Jesus' death allows us to approach God. And it's through that, nothing that we did, but it's through that, faith alone, you have to believe that. And this, again, is a huge difference from the Protestants of this time period. So these are his main points. The Bible is the only source of truth. Now, if I was highlighting anything, this would be a big thing. People can read and understand the Bibles because themselves, so he would also favor Wycliffe translating, and salvation comes through faith, not works, not through doing things. As you can imagine, Luther was excommunicated. He was brought before the Diet of Worms, which was a city, it's a city, and this was a meeting. A diet is like an assembly or congress. And he was brought before the emperor. He refused to recant. They're like, take back what you said. And he's like, nope. And so for a while they're able to kind of defend him. He survives for so long because he has a lot of friends in high places and they protect him for a long time. Now, a lot of German nobles actually support him. Now, let's think about this. Why would German nobles support them? Well, here's the thing. The Catholic Church owned a lot of land. And if you get rid of the Catholic Church, who's going to get that land? Well, the nobles hoped they would. So there's definitely an advantage for them supporting Luther. And some people, of course, believe what he said. Luther's also going to say lots of things that are very different. He's going to say that priests should be able to get married. Later in his life, he's going to marry a former nun. He believes also that during the church service that the priest should actually give a sermon. He should give a time where he talks and tries to teach people. So if you think about church today, that's very much Luther influenced that. He is, though, eventually excommunicated. He's expelled from the church. Remember, why is that a big deal? If you don't have church membership, you can't go to heaven. But again, Luther doesn't believe that. Then the Bible doesn't say that. And so he believes the Bible's the ultimate authority, and he says it's by faith. And so there are people who still don't like Luther, and Germany's actually going to kind of split. So you've got the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, who actually tries to keep Luther's writings from being passed around. Remember, we have the printing press now, so everybody's able to read and kind of see these ideas. But there are a lot of people who are in favor. And so there's a lot of princes, actually, where we get the name the Protestant Reformation. They issued, and I'm going to butcher this word, but I think it's a protestito, or protest. So we're going to stop here today. Again, if I went too fast, make sure you pause. We got everything filled in. And then we're going to pick up next class with what is on the back of your notes about John Calvin and everything.